This 1874 plantation portrait looks peaceful until you notice the boy's wrist. At first glance, it seems like just another family photograph from the Reconstruction South, a respectable household, well-dressed and composed, but one detail refuses to settle, one mark that changes everything. Dr. Eleanor Chen had been cataloging the Whitfield collection for 8 months when she found it. She worked as a photographic archivist at a small museum in Savannah, Georgia, specializing in 19th century Southern portraiture. The estate had donated 17 boxes of daguerreotypes, tintypes, and albumen prints, each one a window into a world that wanted desperately to be remembered as genteel. This particular photograph arrived in a leather portfolio wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed to the color of old cream. The image showed a family of 5 positioned on the wide front porch of a plantation house. The columns were elegant, the floorboards freshly painted. The father stood with one hand resting on his wife's shoulder, the other holding a walking stick. 3 daughters arranged themselves in descending height, their dresses pressed and their hair carefully pinned. And there, at the edge of the frame, stood a black boy who looked about 10 years old. He held a wicker basket filled with what appeared to be freshly cut flowers. Eleanor had seen hundreds of photographs like this. The composition was standard for the 1870s. Families often posed with their servants to display both prosperity and the supposed harmony of their household. But something about this boy's posture made her pause. His head was tilted at an odd angle, not quite facing the camera. His free hand hung stiffly at his side, and his expression, what little she could make out in the faded image, seemed fixed in a way that went beyond the long exposure times that made everyone in old photographs look solemn. She pulled the print closer to the lamp on her desk and reached for her magnifying glass. The boy's sleeve had been rolled up, probably because of the heat. And there, just visible above where his hand gripped the basket handle, she saw it, a band of discolored skin circling his wrist. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, a mark that was slightly raised, slightly darker than the surrounding flesh, with an edge that suggested metal had pressed there recently. Fresh enough that the inflammation had not yet faded when the photographer arranged everyone for the portrait. Eleanor set down the magnifying glass and felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not just another pretty old photo. Something here was wrong. She had been doing this work for 11 years. Before Savannah, she had cataloged collections at the Smithsonian and at a private archive in Charleston. She had examined thousands of images from the antebellum and Reconstruction periods, learned to read the tiny clues that most people missed. The quality of fabric that revealed whether a family was truly wealthy or just performing wealth for the camera. The tension in a smile that suggested the portrait was taken during a period of financial strain. The way enslaved people were positioned in early photographs, often blurred at the edges or cut off entirely, as if the camera itself wanted to make them disappear. But this was different. This was evidence of something immediate, something physical. Someone had shackled this boy recently enough that his skin still bore the injury. Eleanor carefully removed the photograph from its mount. The backing was stiff cardboard, browned with A. She turned it over and found what she was looking for. Stamped in fading ink. J. Caldwell, Photographic Studio, Milledgeville, Georgia, 1874. Below that, written in pencil in a careful hand, Whitfield family, September. And then, almost as an afterthought, a single initial and a number, T127. She photographed the back of the image with her phone, then placed the print between 2 sheets of archival paper and returned it to its folder. Her hands were steady. Her mind was already making a list. Find out who J. Caldwell was, track down records from Milledgeville in 1874, figure out what T127 meant, and most importantly, find out who this boy was and why someone had marked his wrist with iron. If she ignored this, it would stay buried, just another anonymous child in the background of someone else's portrait. And that felt suddenly like a betrayal. The next morning, Eleanor began with the obvious threads. J. Caldwell turned out to be John Augustus Caldwell, a prominent photographer in Milledgeville during the 1870s. His studio had served the local elite, taking portraits of families, officials, and even a few visiting politicians. City directories listed him at 34 Main Street from 1871 to 1883. After that, the trail went cold. Eleanor found an obituary from 1885 that mentioned he had died of typhoid fever, survived by a wife and 2 sons. Nothing in his brief biography suggested he was anything other than a competent professional trying to make a living in a town still recovering from the war. She moved on to the Whitfield family. Census records from 1870 and 1880 gave her a framework. The father was Marcus Whitfield, age 43 in 1874, a cotton planter who had inherited 300 acres from his father. His wife was Catherine, 38. The three daughters were Margaret, Louisa, and Ellen. The 1870 census listed 6 people living on the property identified as servants, all black, all with single first names and no surnames recorded. By 1880, the number had dropped to 3. Eleanor cross-referenced the names with property records and found something that made her pause. In 1872, Marcus Whitfield had filed a petition with the county court seeking the indenture of a minor under the state's apprenticeship laws. The petition listed the child as Thomas, a colored boy, approximately 9 years old, orphaned and in need of supervision. The court had granted the petition, binding Thomas to the Whitfield household until he reached the age of 21. Thomas, T. The initial on the back of the photograph. Eleanor sat back in her chair and stared at the screen. Apprenticeship laws had been common in the South after the Civil War, ostensibly designed to provide care and training for orphaned or destitute children. But everyone who studied the period knew what they really were. They were a legal mechanism to re-enslave black children, exploiting loopholes in the 13th Amendment that allowed involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime or through binding contracts. She needed to talk to someone who specialized in this. She sent an email to Dr. Marcus Bellamy, a historian at Emory University who had published extensively on convict leasing and forced labor in Georgia during Reconstruction. He responded within an hour and agreed to meet her the following week. When they sat down in his office, surrounded by stacks of primary documents and shelves of books on Southern legal history, Eleanor showed him the photograph and the records she had found. Marcus studied the image carefully, then looked up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "The wrist," he said. "You're seeing the mark." "Yes." "And you want to know how a boy supposedly apprenticed to a respectable family ended up with fresh shackle marks in 1874? "Exactly." Marcus leaned back and pulled a file from his desk. "Let me tell you what the apprenticeship system actually looked like in Georgia. After emancipation, white planters lost their labor force. They tried wages, but that gave black workers too much leverage. They tried sharecropping, but that still required negotiation. So they turned to the law. They lobbied for vagrancy statutes, contract enforcement provisions, and apprenticeship codes that let them reclaim black children under the guise of benevolence." He opened the file and pulled out a photocopied document. "Here's a petition from 1871. A planter in Baldwin County claims a 13-year-old black girl is wandering without supervision and requests she be bound to his household. The court grants it within a week. No hearing, no representation for the child, just a signature." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. And if the child resisted? Then they had a problem. Because the child wasn't technically enslaved, they couldn't legally chain them or whip them the way they used to. But Marcus paused and met her eyes. They found a workaround. They would claim the child had violated the terms of the apprenticeship, stolen something, run away, acted with insolence. Then they'd file a complaint with the county, and the child would be arrested and sentenced to a term of labor. Once you're a convict, the 13th Amendment doesn't protect you. You can be leased out, chained, worked to death. "Convict leasing," Eleanor said quietly. "Exactly. And Baldwin County, where Milledgeville is located, had one of the most active convict leasing systems in the state. They leased prisoners to plantations, railroads, mines, men, women, children. It didn't matter. And the beauty of the system, from their perspective, was that it was legal, documented, official." Eleanor thought about the number on the back of the photograph. 127. Could that be a convict identification number? Marcus nodded slowly. "It could be. Let me make some calls." Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor and Marcus pieced together a fuller picture. They traveled to Milledgeville and spent 3 days in the basement of the county courthouse, going through ledgers that had not been digitized. They found Thomas listed in the convict register for 1873. The charge, theft of a bushel of corn. The sentence, 6 months of labor, leased back to Marcus Whitfield, 6 months for a bushel of corn. A boy who was already bound to the household, now recategorized as a criminal to justify the chains. They found other children in the same register, girls as young as 7, boys as young as 9. The charges were always petty: loitering, disrespect, theft of goods worth less than $1. The sentences ranged from 3 months to 2 years, and almost every child was leased back to the same household that had filed the complaint. Eleanor requested records from the state's Convict Leasing Bureau and found that Baldwin County had leased an average of 43 prisoners per year between 1868 and 1876. 20% of them were under the age of 16. The mortality rate for child convicts was nearly triple that of adults. They visited the site of the old Whitfield Plantation, now subdivided into farmland and a small housing development. The main house was gone, replaced by a ranch-style home built in the 1960s. But the columns from the front porch had been salvaged and repurposed as decorative pillars flanking the driveway. Eleanor stood in front of them and imagined Thomas standing there in September 1874, his wrist still raw, holding a basket of flowers, while a photographer named Caldwell adjusted his camera. She thought about the number 127, about the way the apprenticeship system had been designed to look respectable on paper while functioning as a trap, about the precision with which the South had rebuilt slavery using the architecture of law. Marcus found a reference in a church archive that gave them a last name: Thomas Collier. His mother had died in 1871, probably during childbirth, and his father had disappeared from the records entirely. The church listed him as placed with the Whitfield household in 1872, the same year Marcus Whitfield filed the apprenticeship petition. They found no record of Thomas after 1876, no census entry, no death certificate, no mention in any ledger or registry. At some point between the photograph and the 1880 census, he vanished from the documentary record entirely. Eleanor brought the research back to the museum. She drafted a proposal for a new exhibition that would reframe the Whitfield collection, using the photograph of Thomas as the centerpiece. She titled it "Bound in Plain Sight: Convict Leasing and the Theft of Black Childhood in Reconstruction, Georgia." The museum's board met to review the proposal 3 weeks later. Eleanor sat at the far end of a long table in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and old wood. The photograph was projected on the screen behind her, blown up so that everyone could see the mark on Thomas's wrist. The director, a man named Paul Hargrove, who had led the museum for 15 years, cleared his throat. "Dr. Chen, no one is disputing your research. The convict leasing system was real. It was brutal. We understand that. But," he paused and glanced at the other board members, "we have to think about how this will be received. The Whitfield family are significant donors. Their descendants still live in this community. We can't just accuse them of crimes without being absolutely certain." Eleanor kept her voice calm. "I'm not accusing anyone of crimes. I'm presenting historical evidence. Marcus Whitfield used a legal system designed to exploit black children. That system existed. The documents prove it." One of the board members, a retired judge named Harrison, leaned forward. "But you're interpreting the evidence in a very specific way. An apprenticeship wasn't slavery. The law allowed it. We can't judge people in the 1870s by today's standards." "The people in the 1870s knew exactly what they were doing," Eleanor said. "They created apprenticeship laws right after the Civil War ended because they lost their enslaved labor force. They charged children with fake crimes so they could lease them back into bondage. This wasn't a gray area. This was deliberate." Another board member, a woman named Susan, who worked in fundraising, spoke up. "What about the photograph itself? You're saying that mark on his wrist is proof he was shackled, but couldn't it be something else? A burn? An accident?" Marcus, who had been invited to attend as a consultant, answered before Eleanor could. "The mark is consistent with short-term restraint using metal cuffs. It circles the entire wrist. It shows inflammation along the edges where the skin was compressed, and it appears in a photograph taken during the exact period when Thomas was listed in the convict register. The simplest explanation is the correct one. He was chained." The room went silent for a moment. Paul Hargrove shuffled his papers. "I think we need more time to consider this. Let's table the discussion for now and revisit it next quarter." Eleanor felt something break inside her, but she kept her face neutral. "This is exactly the kind of story the museum exists to tell. We claim to educate people about Southern history. We can't do that if we only tell the comfortable version." No one is saying we should avoid difficult topics, Paul said. We just need to be strategic about how we present them. The meeting ended without a decision. Eleanor walked out of the room with Marcus beside her. They stood in the parking lot, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. They're not going to approve it, Marcus said. I know. So what are you going to do? Eleanor looked back at the museum building, at the neat brick facade and the sign that promised visitors a chance to explore the region's rich heritage. She thought about Thomas Collier, who had been 10 years old when someone put him in chains and who had disappeared from history without anyone noticing. I'm going to find another way, she said. She spent the next 3 months building a case outside the museum's walls. She wrote an article for a peer-reviewed journal on convict leasing in Baldwin County, using the photograph of Thomas as the lead image. She worked with Marcus to compile a database of every child listed in the county convict registers between 1868 and 1880, cross-referencing them with census records and apprenticeship petitions. They found 87 children who had been bound to households and then convicted of minor offenses. 87 children who had been legally enslaved through the machinery of the court. A journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reached out after reading the article. She came to Savannah, interviewed Eleanor and Marcus, and spent a week in the courthouse archives verifying the findings. Her story ran on the front page of the Sunday edition under the headline, "The Children Georgia Forgot: How Convict Leasing Stole Black Childhoods After Emancipation." The photograph of Thomas went viral. People shared it on social media, zooming in on his wrist, posting angry comments about how textbooks had lied to them, how they had been taught that Reconstruction was a time of healing and progress. Museums across the South began reviewing their own collections, looking for similar images, similar stories that had been hiding in plain sight. 3 months after the article ran, the museum's board held another meeting. This time, Paul Hargrove opened by saying they had received significant public pressure to re-examine the Whitfield collection. Several major donors had called to express support for Eleanor's proposed exhibition. The board voted unanimously to approve it. Eleanor designed the exhibition with Marcus's help. They built it around Thomas's photograph, but they included the broader context, maps showing where children had been leased across Georgia, excerpts from court petitions and convict registers, a timeline comparing apprenticeship laws in different southern states, and most importantly, they included voices from Black communities who had resisted. They found records from a church in Milledgeville that had kept its own ledger of children who had been taken. The congregation had tried to intervene, filing complaints with federal authorities, writing letters to newspapers, sending delegations to the state capitol. Most of their efforts had been ignored or suppressed, but the records existed, the names existed, and now they would be seen. Eleanor tracked down descendants of Thomas Collier. It took months, following threads through church records and family genealogies. She eventually found a woman named Grace Dawson living in Atlanta. Grace's great-great-grandmother had been Thomas's sister. She had been 9 years older and had managed to escape the apprenticeship system by marrying young and moving to Savannah. Grace came to the museum on the day the exhibition opened. She stood in front of Thomas's photograph for a long time, staring at the boy who had been erased from her family's history. Eleanor stood beside her, not speaking, just waiting. Finally, Grace said, "We knew something happened to him. My grandmother used to say that her mother never talked about her brother, just said he was lost. We thought maybe he died of disease. Everyone died of disease back then, but this." She gestured at the photograph, at the mark on Thomas's wrist. "This is different." "I'm sorry we couldn't find out what happened to him after 1876, Eleanor said. Grace shook her head. "You found him. You found proof that he existed, that someone hurt him, and that it wasn't his fault. That's more than we had before." The exhibition ran for 6 months and attracted more visitors than any show the museum had hosted in the past decade. School groups came through, teachers using the story as a lens to talk about how laws could be used as weapons, how systems of oppression adapted and survived even after emancipation. Historians visited to study the documents. Filmmakers asked permission to use the photograph in a documentary. Paul Hargrove apologized to Eleanor privately. He told her he had been afraid of controversy, afraid of losing donors, afraid of making the museum seem too political. He admitted that fear had made him complicit in silence. Eleanor accepted the apology but did not forget the months of resistance. She understood that institutions moved slowly, that people needed time to confront uncomfortable truths. But she also understood that every day they delayed was another day that Thomas's story stayed buried. The photograph changed how people saw old portraits. Museums began training staff to look for hidden details, to ask questions about the people positioned at the edges of the frame. Universities incorporated the image into their curricula on Reconstruction and the carceral state. And slowly, more photographs surfaced. Other children with marks on their wrists or ankles. Other families posed beside servants who were not servants at all, but prisoners, leased and bound and erased. Eleanor knew that Thomas Collier was one of thousands, that his photograph had survived by chance, that most children like him left no image behind at all. But his story had broken open a door that had been sealed for more than a century. It had made visible a system that the South had worked very hard to disguise as law and order. Old photographs are not neutral. They were composed to project power, to show the world what a family wanted to be remembered for. They were staged in ways that reinforced hierarchies, that made exploitation look like care, that turned violence into backdrop. But sometimes the truth leaks through. A shadow in the wrong place, a hand positioned strangely, a mark on a child's wrist that should not be there. Every image contains evidence. Every portrait holds the possibility of another story beneath the story its subjects wanted to tell. And when we learn to read those hidden details, when we refuse to look away from the marks left by chains, we give back something to the people who had no power when the camera clicked. We restore their presence. We say their names. We insist that they mattered, that what was done to them was wrong, and that the stories we tell about the past must include them, even when the truth is painful, even when it costs us comfort. Thomas Collier stood on a porch in September 1874, holding a basket of flowers, and someone noticed the mark on his wrist. That noticing became testimony. That testimony became memory. And memory, even memory recovered more than a century late, is its own form of justice.